Late on the night of the 18th of September 1988, an angry young man named Riaz Ahmad Sheikh arrived outside the gate of Deputy Inspector General of Police Ali Muhammad Watali's home in Srinagar. Brandishing a weapon, the kind of which no one had seen before, he loudly demanded that the officer be awakened and brought out to meet his fate. Alarmed, a sentry at Watali's gate put his .303 Lee Enfield rifle to good use. Later, senior officers gathered to look at Sheikh's unusual weapon, the like of which they'd never seen. Someone dug a gun encyclopedia out of a local library, and then they understood that it was, in fact, the fabled Kalashnikov assault rifle. Sheikh, to those thus minded politically, is now remembered as the first martyr of the ongoing jihad in Jammu and Kashmir. Watali, a living library of the story of secessionism and terrorism in Kashmir, has lived to a ripe old age, watching the tides of history wash past his door. Hi, and welcome to the Print Explorer. To regular viewers, my special thanks for coming back. With India and Pakistan in the middle of military exchanges that could yet lead to their fifth full-scale war, I want to explore today how we got here. Everyone knows the rough story. Pakistan-sponsored terrorism began in 1988, claiming thousands and thousands of lives. And then India finally began hitting back across the LC in 2016, in 2019, and now. Except that isn't the whole story. The story didn't even begin in 1988, but decades earlier, with a cast of colourful and complex characters who have mostly been forgotten in and outside Kashmir. As usual, the print version of this episode will have a list of 3 books that you may find interesting, with more on this topic. Let's set the scene first. In 1952, elections to Jammu and Kashmir's Constituent Assembly were due, an important step towards integrating the then state into India. Remember, in 1947-1948, India had fought a war in which India held on to one part of Jammu and Kashmir, and Pakistan grabbed what is today called Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Pakistan was determined, however, not to let the Jammu and Kashmir, the Indian side, stabilize and integrate. From the spring of 1951 and right up to 1952, a full-scale mobilization was ordered by Pakistan, threatening to go to war. At the same time, there were a string of covert attacks meant to create destabilization. Some examples: on the 20th of August 1951, the government rest house at Akkad, along with a nearby bridge, was set on fire. 5 other bridges on roads leading in and out of Srinagar were also set on fire, and a military telephone line from Srinagar to Gulmarg was cut. Although India and Pakistan ended their first war formally on the 1st of January 1949, the police officer Surendra Nath was later to record that the ceasefire was, and I quote, merely a prelude to the Pakistani effort to grab Kashmir by other means. And what did he mean by other means? Well, by the spring of 1948, Pakistan had begun to use covert tactics to supplement its conventional military pressure. Police raids carried out that year led to the recovery of 643 bombs, 666 hand grenades, and 83 tins of fuses meant for attacks. It's a pretty large number even by today's standards. Police investigators discovered that this material had been brought into Jammu and Kashmir by a Srinagar resident working for Pakistani intelligence called Salim Jahangir Khan. Now, around the same time, this kind of running of weapons to disputed regions of India was quite common. Pakistan's covert services also were running weapons to Hyderabad to prop up the regime there through a remarkable Australian mercenary spy and adventurer called Sidney Cotton, whose story I'll return to in a future episode. Anyway, in Hyderabad, a lot of those weapons went to the Islamist organization of Qasim Rizvi, which had initiated armed resistance to Indian rule. Lieutenant General Gul Hassan Khan, the last commander-in-chief of the Pakistan Armed Forces, has recorded that an unnamed elder statesman organized at least one of those shipments, some boxes of .22 caliber pistols, on one of Cotton's DC-3 Dakota aircraft. From 1951, Pakistani covert warfare in Jammu and Kashmir acquired sharper focus, the consequence of the fact that the elections to the state's Constituent Assembly were nearing. On 20th August 1951, for example, a government-owned rest house and a bridge at Akkad were set on fire. The group eventually held responsible for the arson were also found to have been responsible for the 5 earlier acts of sabotage, including the burning of bridges that I'd mentioned. A forest department office had been burned down, military telephone lines cut down as well. 14 members of the covert group that carried out the attacks were eventually tried, of whom 9 were convicted to various prison sentences. Several Pakistani nationals, including Abbas Ali Shah, the superintendent of police in charge of the Criminal Investigation Department in Rawalpindi, and Major Asghar Ali Shah, a military officer based at Hillan in Pakistan-administered Kashmir, were also charged with a role in the attacks. As far as I have been able to determine, this was the first legally supported Indian charge of Pakistani state complicity in acts of terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir. Many, many decades ago. Despite India's irritation, this early covert war in Jammu and Kashmir seemed to be a low-cost, low-risk enterprise. India was, and remember these were the years after partition when the country was desperately poor, India was obviously not going to go to war because someone had burned down a couple of bridges or cut some wires. Yet, to Pakistan's supporters within Jammu and Kashmir, such operations demonstrated that all was not yet lost for them. Soon, they began considering plans for expanding the jihad in Jammu and Kashmir, as its proponents and protagonists understood it to be. These made their way slowly up through Pakistan's establishment. Major General Akbar Khan, the officer who had commanded Pakistan's offensive operations in 1947-1948, first provided an outline of how a 500-man covert group could be raised to target, I quote, unguarded bridges, isolated wires, and unprotected transport. In Khan's view, in the unlikely event that such harrying led to war, I quote again, so much the better, as this would tend to threaten the existing international peace, and only then would there be a reason for the United Nations again to take note of the Kashmir problem. Interesting. By Khan's account, Malik Feroz Khan Noon, who took power as Pakistan's Prime Minister in 1957, made operational these offensive plans under the command of a police officer, Mian Anwar Ali. Anti-India propaganda material began to flow across the ceasefire line, and so did 4 new covert groups controlled directly from Pakistan-administered Kashmir by a deputy superintendent of police, Khan Muhammad Khan. 3 groups led by Bagh Ali, Ismail and Rahim operated in the Jammu province. 2 others, under the command of Jahangir Khan and Aziz Parwana, were given charge of the Kashmir Valley. Religious indoctrination played a major role in the training of this cadre, which is interesting because the jihadist groups we associate with this kind of activity didn't actually exist at the time. Apart from several explosions in public places, including a Srinagar mosque, the groups also carried out at least one targeted assassination, the murder of a Hindu nationalist politician who had played a prominent role in communal violence in the Poonch area called Rupe Shah. Indian officials also charged that these groups had the support of Jammu and Kashmir's most prominent politician, Sheikh Mohammad Abdullah. The complex story of Abdullah's involvement in what came to be known as the Kashmir conspiracy case is again a very long story that needs a separate exploration, but I'll touch on it very briefly here. At the end of 1957, the loss of life caused by terrorism was absurdly low by today's standards. And yet, the characters in the script authored by Pakistan's covert services were already beginning to write their own lines. Even though Indian counterintelligence had successfully shut down their operations, the covert groups of the 1950s had scored several notable successes. First, the covert groups had succeeded in creating some degree of political ferment in Jammu and Kashmir, adding weight to voices in the states politically opposed to its accession to India. Second, the groups had succeeded in inflicting costs upon India. Small costs, but costs nonetheless, without letting events spiral up towards war. As such, the secret jihad seemed a low-cost, high-yield investment, one into which it was well worth the Pakistan army pumping in further resources. But third, and perhaps most important of all, The strategic balance between the two adversaries soon appeared to have been transformed by India's defeat at the hands of China in 1962. Pakistani strategists now began seeing India as an unsustainable national project, one which would require only the slightest push before its multiple social and ethnic fissures widened to the point of disintegration. Following India's defeat in 1962, Pakistan's supporters in Jammu and Kashmir claimed circumstances were ripe for a general insurrection in the state. Widespread anti-India protests, which had broken out after the disappearance of a relic from the shrine of Hazrat Bal in 1964, seemed to be evidence of this widespread disaffection. On that occasion, the government of India effectively collapsed and local political rulers ran the region for several weeks. Pakistan did not, contrary to popular belief, turn to planning for war at this stage. Its first effort was to create a core for the insurrectionary movement it believed could now break off at any time. Thus, in June 1964, it threw its weight behind what came to be known to Indian counterintelligence as the Master Cell, a covert group founded by Mia Ghulam Sarwar, Bashir Ahmad Kichlu, and Zafarul Islam. Within months, the Master Cell had spawned a series of propaganda and military subsidiaries, as well as units to work with operatives who were launched across what was called the ceasefire line then, along with the Pakistani forces who invaded Jammu and Kashmir in the summer of 1965. The Master Cell's structure wasn't particularly innovative or sinister. It drew on well-established traditions of revolutionary covert activity. But its tactics and ideological positions were expressly Islamist in character. One of the key operatives in these cells, a man called Hayat Mir, tried and executed a woman for her supposed promiscuity, the first instance of a jihadi court being held in Jammu and Kashmir. Social banditry of a kind calculated to provoke communal schisms was another favored tactic. So we see from contemporary records, for example, that a Budgam-based grocer named Rajnath was attacked and his goods distributed among the local poor. In the middle of the 1965 war, the Master Cell demonstrated terror capabilities significantly more lethal than those its predecessors had had. Grenades, for example, were thrown in the crowded Regal Chowk and Lal Chowk areas of Srinagar. Extensive urban propaganda was also carried out through leaflets. Although the war ended in a ceasefire, a kind of draw, the Master Cell continued its campaign. By late 1965, when Indian counterintelligence finally caught up with its leadership, the Master Cell was on the verge of conducting several major operations. One unit had made plans to assassinate the Jammu and Kashmir Chief Minister G.M. Sadiq and its Home Minister D.P. Dhar. Another, using caches of plastic explosives left behind by Pakistani forces, was preparing for an urban bombing offensive. Pakistani covert services evidently believed there was still life in the project. So soon after the termination of the Master Cell, efforts began to be put to build a new jihadist organization and reconsolidate these activities. In late 1966, a long-standing veteran of the secret war in Jammu and Kashmir, Ghulam Rasool Zahgir, and his Pakistani intelligence handlers began to give these cells a new name. They would call it Al-Fatah, or the victory. Zahgir's victory for Al-Fatah drew heavily on the tactics of left-wing national liberation movements, notably those of the anti-colonial Front for National Liberation in Algeria, which was very powerful at that time. All of this, as the eminent scholar Steve Cohen noted, mirrored developments within Pakistan's armed forces. Pakistani strategists, you see, had paid very close attention to debates in the United States that were taking place on guerrilla warfare and Maoist notions of people's war. After all, the United States was mired in counterinsurgency in Vietnam. But where the United States sought to prevent such wars, Stephen Cohen has perceptively pointed out, Pakistan studied these. It wanted to know how it could launch a people's war against India. Al-Fatah carried out its first military operations in February 1967, the murder of a border security force constable on the Navakadal bridge in Srinagar. It was a relatively small action, but Zahgir understood the need for patience. The war against India, he recorded in his diaries, would have to slowly involve weakening the enemy, just as, I quote, a mosquito does while fighting with an elephant. After this inaugural act of violence, Al-Fatah set up a training camp in the forests above Birwa, using a facility first established for the master cells Pakistani operatives back in 65, and began to funnel cadre there for training in Pakistan. These cadre, when they came back, were used for a series of spectacular bank robberies, notably of the treasury of the Education Department in Pulwama and the vaults of the Jammu and Kashmir Bank's Hazratbal branch. One of the operatives who carried out this last robbery, however, was recognized, and the Jammu and Kashmir Police's exceptionally competent counterintelligence personnel soon succeeded in arresting Zahgir himself. His handler at the Pakistan High Commission in New Delhi, Zafar Iqbal Rathore, enjoyed diplomatic immunity and was thus simply expelled from India. The man who actually supervised the operation against these terrorists was Ali Muhammad Watali, the very officer on whose life the modern phase of jihad would begin by attempting his assassination. Why did Al-Fatah fail? It was certainly not for want of enthusiasm or commitment. Fazlul Haq Qureshi, who went on to become a politician of certain prominence in secessionist circles in Jammu and Kashmir, placed on record the fact that Al-Fatah had succeeded in sending 300 cadre for training to Pakistan by 1971, recruiting from mosques across the countryside. Rather, Fazlul Haq said, the real problem was that weapons were not forthcoming, as Pakistan had decided the time was not ripe to arm the jihadis. From Salim Jahangir, the Pakistani agent who ran Al-Fatah's training camp, Zahgir learned that large caches of Sten guns did exist with which he could have armed his cadre in Kashmir. However, Haji Jalaluddin, the operative who held the weapons, had strict instructions not to hand them over to Al-Fatah until he got the green light from Pakistan's covert services. Had those assets been made over to Al-Fatah, it is possible it would not have been forced to conduct the kinds of high-risk, low-yield operations like the bank robberies that eventually led to its dismantling. Why didn't Pakistan help? Well, by 1971, Islamabad's attentions were firmly focused to the east, not on Jammu and Kashmir. India was in the process of doing to Pakistan and Bangladesh what Pakistan had sought to do in Jammu and Kashmir in 1971, cutting apart the country using massive irregular campaign supplemented by conventional military force. In the build-up to the war of 1971, Pakistan didn't want to give India any pretext to go to war, and that meant keeping Al-Fatah very, very quiet. Things were silent for a while, but if you went to the right part of the hills, you could hear this anthem sometimes. Azadi ka ek hi dhang, gorilla jang, gorilla jang. The only one way to freedom is guerrilla war, guerrilla war. That was the anthem of the National Liberation Front, founded in 1965. The NLF was born of the conviction that for the jihad in Jammu and Kashmir to be successful, it would, as far as possible, have to be independent of the Pakistan's military and covert services. The realization was in part pragmatic. Pakistan's strategic weakness was clear to all after its defeat in the 1965 war. But in practice, the vision of an independent armed struggle proved much more difficult to bring about than the NLF leadership had perhaps envisaged. The first foray the NLF made into Jammu and Kashmir was betrayed. They were still amateurs at the game of spies and counter-espionage. Then in the autumn of 1966, after two NLF units which crossed the ceasefire line had been active for barely 8 weeks, their three top leaders were arrested after a firefight which claimed the life of a police officer and an intelligence operative. With its founder and top ideologue Muhammad Maqbool Butt in jail, facing a sentence of death, the organization went into a 3-year period of retreat. Then, in 1969, the NLF had a lucky break. A young Srinagar resident named Hashim Qureshi offered his services to the organization towards the end of 1969 during a personal visit to Peshawar. Inspired by the September 1970 hijacking of 5 aircraft by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Qureshi and his cousin Altaf Qureshi decided to stage a similar enterprise on behalf of the NLF. We've discussed this in a previous episode of The Explorer. The hijacking, those of you who have watched that episode will know, ended successfully. But in the 1971 war that followed, Pakistan itself was viscerated. And after that experience, the Pakistani intelligence services weren't looking for trouble with India. For a decade after the 1971 war, the NLF went into decline. Much of its leadership left Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and moved to the United Kingdom. Those who attempted to join the jihad received a less than enthusiastic welcome in Pakistan. In May 1973, for example, a group of students led by Sayyid Nazir Gilani abandoned their studies in Kashmir University and reported as volunteers at a Pakistani military post across what is now called the line of control. For their pains, all of them were jailed and tortured. There were small NLF operations within Jammu and Kashmir, notably the attempted bombing of an Indian military parade, but none which demonstrated any great capacity. Pakistan's covert services, for their part, began to busy themselves in the north, fighting the pro-Moscow regime which had taken power in Kabul. In 1974, for example, Pakistan sponsored an Islamist-led covert campaign to retaliate against Afghan support for the incorporation of ethnic Pashtun areas within its territory. This so-called Pashtunistan movement had gathered momentum after the creation of Bangladesh, and Pakistan was very worried it would succeed. Without the kinds of large-scale direct military support that India had made available to Bangladesh insurgents, however, the Pashtunistan movement went nowhere. By the mid-1980s, the NLF existed more in London than in Kashmir. It briefly toyed with the idea of staging an attack on the 1983 summit of non-aligned states in New Delhi, but found it just didn't have the resources to do so. Then in January 1984, the NLF assassinated Ravindra Matre, a mid-ranking Indian diplomat serving in the United Kingdom. The operation was carried out even as another NLF cell considered executing another hijacking. Again, the bankruptcy of its capabilities are illustrated by the fact that the training for this hijack operation consisted of Altaf Qureshi along with his fellow would-be hijackers Afzal Tahir and Malik Ejaz watching a popular movie to acquaint themselves with, I quote, the new tactics in hijacking. Matre's assassination had no real impact on the fortunes of the jihad in Jammu and Kashmir. In fact, its only consequence was that India promptly carried out the legally sanctioned hanging of Maqbool Bhatt, the founder of the NLF, who had been in jail for many years. Until the mid-1980s then, the jihad in Jammu and Kashmir had passed through three distinct phases. The low-grade war, which began after 1948 and culminated in the Master Cell. Al-Fatah, which was the child of the study of the new People's War techniques that were being practiced in Vietnam and Algeria. And of course, the quasi-independent operations of the Master Cell leading up to the 1970s. And then came the 1980s, and everything changed. Terror, wrote the Pakistani military theoretician Brigadier S.K. Malik, is not a means of imposing a decision upon the enemy. It is the decision we wish to impose upon him. President Zia-ul-Haq's rise in Pakistan and the long Western-supported jihad against the Soviet Union and Afghanistan had made this kind of thinking influential in Pakistani military circles. And in 1988, hundreds of armed jihadist cadre equipped with weapons of a quality and quantity never seen in India before began streaming across the line of control to begin the latest phase of the jihad, which continues to this day. This war, like the other phases of the covert campaign, has been interrupted by full-scale crises regularly. You had the 1999 Kargil War, the 2001-2002 standoff, the cross-border strikes of 2016 and 2019. And yet, the jihad goes on. Why then did this particular phase of war take on the unimaginably horrific form and durable form it did where others failed? Provoked by the Soviet Union's intervention in Afghanistan, the United States and its West Asian allies began to funnel enormous flows of weapons and funds to the Islamist resistance in Afghanistan. By as early as 1987, at least 80,000 mujahideen had been trained by Pakistan's ISI. In that year alone, that is 87, 65,000 tons of arms and munitions, including high-technology anti-armor and anti-aircraft missiles, were made over to forces battling Soviet and Afghan phases. Pakistan, acutely aware of India's long-standing alliance with the Soviet Union, made the entirely rational decision to now use these resources to exert power on its eastern neighbor. By 1983, Pakistan's covert services began to funnel light weapons, notably Kalashnikov series assault rifles, to groups fighting for the creation of a Sikh theocratic state in Indian Punjab. In past years, this kind of action would have provoked a conventional reprisal from India. And in 1986, that's exactly what India set about doing. In July 1986, India initiated Operation Brass Tacks, a massive exercise intended to demonstrate its capability to wage a full-blown war against Pakistan. Pakistani military strategists, well aware that exercises had been used in the past to disguise real war mobilization, responded by moving up their own reserves into positions that threatened key Indian cities in Punjab. As India's strike formations were too far away to immediately respond, troops were airlifted to defend these cities. An escalatory cycle was well underway when Pakistan's Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Zain Noorani, conveyed what the Indian ambassador in Islamabad at the time took to be a nuclear threat. A more specific warning of Pakistan's new nuclear capabilities was conveyed to the journalist Kuldeep Nayyar on 28 January 1997. Did Pakistan have the bomb by that point, a deliverable weapon? Probably. The United States had looked the other way through the crisis in Afghanistan, not too worried about what Pakistan did in its basement. And the nuclear threat worked. Confronted with an irregular war in 1965, India had responded with a full-scale counter-offensive in the Punjab. This time around, it could not. From after the end of Operation Brass Tacks, levels of violence in Punjab registered a steady increase until 1990-1991, with levels of violence in the worst periods in the Punjab exceeding the worst ever seen in Jammu and Kashmir. And within Jammu and Kashmir itself, levels of violence escalated after 1998, a development closely related to the growing capabilities of terrorist groups. In the 3 years after military victory in Kargil, India would lose many more soldiers to counterinsurgency than all those who fell in the war itself. The question is, why does Pakistan want to keep up a war? It seems to have no chance of actually winning. Among the more plausible explanations I've come across is from the scholar C. Christine Fair, which underlines the Pakistani military's culture of strategic defiance. Essentially, she argues, the Pakistan army also knows it can't win wars. It seeks to demonstrate, though, that it can make the task of winning wars too expensive and too prohibitive for others to contemplate. Another linked proposition is that endless war with India justifies the chokehold the Pakistani military enjoys over the country's economy and civil society. This has, of course, come with terrible costs for the ordinary people of Pakistan themselves. As the economist Akbar Zaidi has documented, the 2-decade-old nuclear jihad period has seen Pakistan's economy decline relative to that of India, the precise opposite of the outcome Pakistani warriors had presumably hoped for. Pakistan's covert services also have a deep ideological commitment to the notion of jihad as a core obligation of the state. General Zia-ul-Haq, you'll remember my telling you earlier in this talk, placed Islam at the core of the Pakistan Army's raison d'etre, its very reason for being. Its involvement in Islamist causes was no longer merely tactical, it was an ideological imperative. This use of Islam to legitimize the state's coercive authority was not, of course, new. General Yahya Khan had, at a late stage of the East Pakistan crisis, described enemy forces as kafirs or unbelievers, and his own troops as mujahideen or soldiers of Islam. The notion of jihad similarly fed and informed each successive phase of covert warfare in Jammu and Kashmir. Terror was in fact seen as having a kind of special religious sanction. This position may not be publicly flaunted, Stephen Cohen has written, but it is widely held in the Pakistan Army. Whether India's ongoing efforts to call Pakistan's nuclear bluff will finally mean the end of the nuclear jihad, I don't know. This could turn out to be a prelude to a new and even more macabre confrontation. We'll have to watch events play out very, very carefully and with an open mind to see what the next steps in this long and tragic story will be. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm a contributing editor to The Print. Thank you for watching this episode of The Print Explorer.